Hi there. So today we'll be talking about Flutter project organization and structure and giving you a high-level view of how a project is built and what the separate components look like for both iOS and Android, as well as the shared components which Flutter uses to actually render your app. So let's get started. So we start off here in Android Studio, so we'll go ahead and start a new Flutter project here. Just give it a sec. It's thinking. Okay. So we have a few different options here. You have a Flutter application, a Flutter plugin, a package, a module. The text here pretty much makes it explanatory. The majority of what you'd be creating would be an application, but if for some reason you wanted to create something that would expose a native API on Android, for example, like let's say there was a particular augmented reality feature that was only available on Android, that would be where you would go and write a plugin. A package would be something that's purely generic, that isn't specific to iOS or Android. So in Flutter, you write using a programming language called Dart, and a lot of what you're writing are these UI components called widgets. And so if you actually go on the internet, there's a site pub.dev, and that's where all these external packages, from some from the Flutter team itself, but some from just open source third-party contributors, will publish repositories of various plugins for different functionality. That could be recording audio, geolocation, things along the lines of that. So if you want to create a generalized package, both for your own use or potentially, contributing it back to the open source community, you'd select Flutter package here, and then Flutter module is, as it mentions down here below, is when you're looking at creating a Flutter component to tack onto an existing Android or iOS app. Again, this is primarily you're going to be spending your time in Flutter application, so we'll stick with that. So we'll go ahead and click next. Okay, so pretty familiar view here, so we'll just leave this as default. We'll just say Flutter project organization. Okay. So we'll go ahead. It's already auto found where the SDK is, and go ahead and save it here. You can put a description. Go ahead and click next. So kind of like what you've seen with different Android or Java applications, there's also going to be a top level package name, which is where our Dart libraries are actually going to live. And let's just stick with all the defaults here. Android X is a series of Android libraries that expose a lot of different functionality, and so we'll want to keep that enabled, as well as enabling Kotlin and Swift support for Android and iOS respectively. So we'll go ahead and click finish, and just wait for it to finish creating our project and setting everything up, and then we'll take a look and see what's actually going on underneath the hood. So typically when you click finish, you're going through kind of a startup wizard like this for any sort of IDE, whether that's Android Studio or a different one. What's actually happening is behind the scenes, there's like a template that has been defined for an entry project, and various source files and build settings for the compiler and default platform settings. And when you go ahead and click finish, it's essentially setting all that up for you. So it looks like it's just about there. We'll just wait for this to spin up here. And what is pretty neat is that Flutter lives inside of Android Studio, so it has really nice integration in terms of the IDE itself. So, all right, so it looks like we're here. Still loading a little bit. Okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and close this. We'll come back to that. So on the left here, you have your project navigator. And so scratches and consoles, if you come from like the iOS world, the scratch would essentially be where you're just writing kind of free-form code that you might want to just test in a very isolated environment that isn't part of a specific project. Again, you can kind of just ignore that. But I like explaining what each thing is, just for your benefit. External libraries, this is where, I'd mentioned about packages. So these are the default packages that are getting imported in here. And if you expand these further, you can actually see the source files. So like this async package for doing asynchronous operations. If I double clicked on that, it actually, let's see. So I guess here, sorry. So the source here, that's actually just the sort of the top level library definition. But if I wanted to actually go and look at the source code for this particular library, I totally could. And if you did need to modify something, you could then change that here. Although if something's a package, you probably don't want to do it in here. You probably want to create a separate folder and then kind of fork it. But essentially any package that you're going to download externally is gonna show up here. So these are the default ones that are appearing, and you might say, well, where would I go to add a package? So if we go over here, so I'll close this for a second just so it's a bit clearer. So you have the top level folder for our project, Flutter Project Organization. And at the root of that, you have something called pubspec.yaml, which is a YAML file, it's similar to kind of JSON or any sort of proprietary, text format where it just has its kind of unique syntax for listing key value pairs and having the ability of nesting fields within each other. So a bunch of settings here, but if you go down to dependencies, right now the only dependencies that we have are just for the core stuff that Flutter needs to run. But if you wanted or needed to have an external library, you would add it on a line below here and basically just be able to copy paste one line of code, import your library, and then it would show up here inside of external libraries. And so if you ever had a question about, well, how does this library work under the hood, you'd be able to actually go in here into the source and examine it, which is pretty cool. Because a lot of times with libraries in the past, it might be something where you'd only be able to see a header file, or essentially, you'd only have read-only access to just seeing the very high-level summary of like how the library works, but not the internals of like what does the source code do. So there's some other settings here. A lot of what this file is going to do has to do with just top-level global settings that apply to your Flutter project. So what is the name of your project? What is the description? You saw me glossing over that in the beginning, but you could easily go and change that here. Talking about the actual Flutter environment, what SDK version are we running of Flutter, what version of our app, and they have little comments here kind of giving nomenclature, but you could go to the documentation and see some more of the built-in settings. And then there's just a default setting here for using material design, which is the Android UI library, and this enables you to be able to use icons, the material design icons by default. They're included in your build. So this is the pubspec.yaml. Pubspec.lock, you don't need to worry about. This is a file that's managed by Flutter. It's very similar if you've ever used like Node or Node.js, where there's a lock file for essentially like the locked dependencies of what like you actually need for your project. And so similar to Gradle, you can see here where there's a pub get command, pub upgrade, pub outdated, and Flutter doctor. If I added a new package here, then I would be able to, and in fact, why don't I go ahead, let me Let me go open a new window, Firefox. Okay. So we'll go and we'll search for a Flutter package and import it so you can actually see. All right. So let's just go and search for Flutter HTTP. And so over here you see the URL for pub.dev, which I was mentioning earlier. And so this is a library that I've used in the past for making HTTP requests, like to a server or to external API, something like that. And you have a real handy tab here where it's saying, hey, how do I install this? Like, I want to use this package. So, it's saying, well, look for your pubspec.yaml file and just basically copy paste this line here saying I want to have the HTTP library, and the little caret means that it should either be this version of 0.12.2 or higher. So the caret is like basically like greater than or equal to. So if we went and go ahead and pub get. Okay. Sometimes the libraries get a little bit buried in here if it's like an actual native Flutter library. But the way to test this, essentially, to see that it worked, is if we go into lib. So this is kind of also a segue into where is your source code actually going to live. So Android and iOS, you very rarely will touch in Flutter. If you need to do something specific in regards to adding a particular permission, like an Android, like for camera permissions or audio permissions, then you would have to kind of dig in here and find the right, project manifest file to set that. Or in the case of iOS, you'd be looking for like the plist, well, not that plist, but like the info.plist file to add different keys for, let's say, access to read and write file, permissions, that sort of thing. So very rarely do you go in here, and these essentially are respectively the project files for both Android and iOS. But in regards to where you're primarily spending your time, it's going to be inside of your lib folder, and right by default they've created a main.dart file. So if I go ahead and open this, and without digging into everything that's going on, let's go and import http.dart. And the reason why it's grayed out is because we're not actually doing anything with the package, but the fact that it was able to find it means that what we did here was able to install this package as a dependencies. So going back here, just to explain what is dev dependencies versus dependencies. This is, again, very similar to the Node.js model, where dependencies are anything that your app needs to run from a user's perspective. So user installs the app. These are all the libraries that are needed to be present there. Dev dependencies are things that you might need during the course of development, but they wouldn't actually be packaged or needed to package the app, like a executable version of the app. So it could be generating launcher icons. There's a really good package for that, actually. That's a really good example of something that you wouldn't need at runtime, but it's a package that helps you create your app icons for iOS and Android. But this would be added, and you'll actually be able to see this here. Well, they're saying it's a dependency, but you could honestly add it as a dev dependency for generating your app icons. So subtle distinction here, but I think it's fairly straightforward and simple. So let's close these out. let's go back here. So if we go back to main.dart, so let's just kind of walk through this file a little bit and explain what's going on here. So, oh, and I guess while this is going on, let me boot up an iOS. Let's see, do I already have an emulator running? Yeah, let's go ahead and run. For a change, let's run the Android emulator, and so that's gonna. I can talk through some of this in the meantime. So at the top here, you have your import statements, and these essentially are saying, hey, I want to import these packages. Very common when you're writing any sort of a UI-based class or a file. You'll need to import like the material file for all the native Flutter widgets and components. Otherwise, it will complain, hey, I don't know about this component. What are you talking about? So that's pretty common. This is the library that, again, we added, but it's grayed out right now because we're not actually doing anything with it. We're not making any HTTP calls, so it's grayed out. So this is kind of your prototypical main function, your entry point to your app. When main is called, then it calls the function myApp, which essentially creates an instance of myApp, which is a widget, a stateless widget. So you have two types of widgets in Flutter. You have a stateless widget and a stateful widget. So a stateless widget is, you can think of it as just like a read-only page. So you can imagine like a web page, like a 90s web page where all the HTML content was just baked into the page and there was nothing dynamic, and every time you loaded the page, it was exactly the same. You know, somebody had typed out all the text that appeared in the page. That would be a stateless widget. Essentially, you've hard-coded into the code exactly everything that's going to appear on screen. Oh, good. Okay, so that's appeared. Down here, you'll see there's something, a stateful widget. So a stateful widget, by contrast, can change. And so when a stateful widget does change, there's a method down here you'll see called build. And build essentially means that the widget re-renders. And you can manually change that by calling a method called setState. And you can really think of that as basically it redraws the screen, it rebuilds, you know, the component tree of everything in Flutter, and then all of your code is going to be able to rerun again. What's really neat about that is that when you're dealing with dynamic data or, you know, just different state, or you might want to conditionally render, like if the user has a toggle button that's on or off, you might want to say, hey, I don't want to render this whole chunk of UI. Well, that's in Flutter terms, like you would be doing that inside of a stateful widget, because whether the box is checked or unchecked would be something that is dynamic. It's not fixed. You could also do many different things, like if you had an HTTP request externally, and, you know, if you're able to connect to the server, you might display a particular, you know, oh, I can't access the server right now page, versus grabbing all the data and then dynamically constructing a page with it. So this is a really powerful approach. You see this a lot in web frameworks, modern web frameworks, like React, in terms of this model of having state and then essentially just being able to conditionally like re-render. So okay, so we have, looks like we have the emulator running. So let's go ahead and run. So now I'm kind of showing you how you would actually run a device. So depending whether you're building for Android or iOS, it will use Gradle for Android and it'll use Xcode to kick off a build for iOS. I found that iOS typically takes a bit longer, and pretty soon in a second you'll be able to see one of the, what I think is just one of the mainstay and fantastic features of Flutter, which really, you know, right now you're going, okay, it's chugging, like the build is taking a while to build, but one of the amazing features of Flutter is something called hot reload, where any piece of Dart code that you modify, when you go and change it, you don't have to do a full recompile. You can essentially instantly see changes loaded in either a on an emulator or on your actual device. And this means development goes super fast, as opposed to having to trigger a rebuild, which again can be really slow. Could be, you know, a few minutes, 3 to 5 minutes on iOS. Instead, any change that you make, you can preview it in seconds. So this is a huge boon to developing with Flutter. So yes, the initial build does take a bit of time, but once you've gotten that build has succeeded, Flutter has essentially an active connection to the emulator or potentially your device, and then any changes that you make, it'll go ahead and reload it. So right now it's still building, so we'll kind of continue. It looks like the APK is installing, but so anyways, so you have a stateless widget, which is essentially the entry point here. You have a build method, which you still have for a stateless widget, but in this case, again, you're not doing anything conditional. It's just telling it, hey, I want to return a material app, which is basically a built-in widget that has kind of a material design styling. It has a lot of built-in fields for it, for having a title, having, you know, primary color, and then having essentially the first home essentially is expecting a widget, which in this case you're saying, okay, I want the body content of this stateless widget to be my homepage. And there's usually you end up creating 2 classes when you're creating a stateful widget, and only one for a stateless. So you first are creating the class itself, which extends stateful widget, and then this is the constructor, which, you know, you can add whatever fields you want. These brackets here, this is also a really cool feature of Dart where you can do optional parameters and do it with very minimal typing, and it will automatically set these fields. So you could not pass title, or you could pass title, and then it would automatically be set in this field. Final essentially means that the field has to be initialized at construction. So it's a little different from const. Const, you're not going to see inside of classes as much. You're going to see final if you want to basically say title can only be set once. Or essentially set when the object is constructed. And then you have an overridden method here for when this is created. So in this case, it's created when we run the build method here, and then, you know, we're constructing my home page with the optional parameter. The syntax for an optional parameter is the name of it, like this. So I could see it, they have like a key one, so you'll be able to see that. So the syntax is like that you would have the name of the parameter, and there's auto hinting, colon, and then whatever the parameter is. Whereas name parameters, like required ones, you'd actually just type them, you know, individually prior to this, but this doesn't actually have one. But we easily could. I mean, we could have something like int, let's do string, you know, text. And then if we did that, it'll say, hey, wait a second, we're expecting a positional argument, which is essentially a required argument. And so then, you know, if I put in, you know, foo, it'll stop complaining. So let's take a look here. So we have this very basic, this is the default code that's spit out. So we just made a change here, and you might say, well, do you have to recompile? The answer is no, because you have 2 buttons here. You have hot reload, and then you have hot restart. And what is the difference between these? So hot reload is great when you just want to reload something that doesn't require on like data or initialization of the app, or would require like a hard reboot of the app to make sure that if you added like a field to a variable that didn't exist and you want to make sure that that value is set properly, you would do a hot restart. If all you're doing is tweaking UI on one page and it isn't contingent in that, then hot reload is slightly faster. They're both so fast that honestly, most of the time I will just do hot restart just to know that nothing weird is happening under the hood. But it can be really helpful if you're working on a very specific UI component, all you're doing is tweaking it, that you just click hot reload. So here I clicked it and it's saying, hey, I reloaded one library, which is this file. It treats each file, a Dart file, as a library. And we didn't see any tangible change to that because I just added a meaningless parameter. But the cool thing is the app essentially rebuilt. And if I had done something incorrect, like, you know, if I had just typed a bunch of garbage like this, and I go and do this, it will actually give me a instant, you know, compile time error. If I get rid of that and then do a hot restart, the app loads again. So just to show you like a real basic example of this, of how this works, is so that title parameter you'll be able to see. So if we'll just say awesome title and I do the hot reload, you see it instantly updates, which is really cool. So just kind of very quickly wrapping up here. So we have, again, two classes that you're going to have. This class, the one that extends the stateful widget, is primarily going to be used to pass in all the constructor parameters that you want to have accessible by the class that's actually going to do the rendering. And then create state is just a boilerplate method that's inherited from a stateful widget that you use to essentially construct the object that's going to build your UI. So in this case, you're always going to extend, most of the time, you're going to extend a state object with the class of my homepage, which is the one you set up here. But if you had your own class, you put it there in the brackets, and then inside of here, this is a variable that's, again, local to this particular class. This is a function that has been implemented here, and then a state class is required to implement a build method. And so the build method determines what actually is rendered on the screen, and all these, you know, at the end of this statement, it's returning a scaffold, which then has a bunch of essentially nested children, and it's up to you to kind of determine what you actually want rendered, or which children and subchildren you want. So that's it for project structure. And as we continue to work on and delve into Flutter, we'll dig into more advanced topics.